The ship was cold and silent as Commander Velshira walked through its metal halls, her four eyes scanning the dim corridors ahead of her, and her long silver robes trailing behind her like a ghost shadow. She had done this walk 1,000 times before on 100 different worlds, and each time she felt the same quiet confidence that came from knowing she was the best at what she did. Velshira was a mindweaver, one of the most feared telepaths in the entire galaxy, and no creature had ever been able to hide its secrets from her crystalline mind. Today, she was going to meet a human, and she expected this would be the easiest interrogation of her long career. The guards at the detention level bowed their heads as she passed, their own minds carefully blank in her presence, because everyone knew better than to think too. Loudly around a Mindweaver commander, she acknowledged them with a phrase, small nod, and continued toward the cell at the end of the corridor. The human had been captured 3 weeks ago from a destroyed research vessel called the Prometheus, and he was the only survivor of whatever catastrophe had torn that ship apart. The Galactic Coalition wanted to know what had happened, and more importantly, they wanted to know what research the humans had been conducting in that remote sector of space. Velshira stopped before the cell door and took a moment to compose herself, not because she was nervous, but because she believed in approaching every mind with focus and precision. She pressed her pale hand against the scanner, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. The cell inside was simple and clean, with white walls and a single bed and a small table with 2 chairs facing each other. Sitting in one of those chairs was the human. He looked up as she entered, and Velshira felt her first small surprise of the day. She had read his file, of course, and she knew his name was Marcus Chun, and that he was a xenobiologist who had spent 15 years studying alien life forms across the galaxy. But reading about humans and seeing one up close were 2 very different things. He was so terribly fragile looking, with soft skin that had no scales or armor, and blunt teeth that could barely tear through cooked meat, and those strange wet eyes that seemed to catch the light in unusual ways. His hair was dark with streaks of gray at the sides, and his hands rested calmly on the table in front of him, showing no signs of fear or tension. "I am Commander Velshira of the Mindweaver Corps," she announced as she took the seat across from him, "and I have been sent to extract information about the destruction of your vessel." The human nodded slowly, his expression remaining calm and almost curious, as if she were an interesting specimen he was studying rather than a predator about to tear through his thoughts. "I understand," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had expected, with a warm quality that seemed strange coming from a prisoner. "Do what you have to do." Velshira tilted her head slightly, her secondary eyes narrowing with interest. Most species begged at this point, or threatened, or tried to bargain for mercy. But this human simply sat there with a kind of tired acceptance that she found oddly unsettling. "You do not seem afraid," she observed. Marcus Chun smiled, and it was a sad smile that touched his eyes in a way she did not fully understand. "Fear won't help me now, will it?" he asked. "You're going to look inside my mind no matter what I say or do, so there's no point in wasting energy on panic." This was true, of course, and Velshira appreciated the logic even if she found the calm delivery somewhat strange. She leaned forward slightly and reached out with her telepathic senses, preparing to enter his mind and strip away every secret he possessed. What she found in the first moment of contact made her freeze in genuine shock. There was music playing in his mind, not the chaotic jumble of thoughts and fears and memories that she usually encountered when touching an alien consciousness, but actual structured music, a strange lilting melody that seemed to dance just beneath the surface of his awareness. She pushed deeper, trying to get past the music to the thoughts beneath. But the melody shifted and changed, becoming something faster and more complex. and she found herself momentarily distracted by its alien beauty. Velshira pulled back slightly and stared at the human with new eyes. "What is that?" she demanded. Marcus looked at her with something that might have been amusement in those wet alien eyes. "What is what?" he asked innocently. "That noise in your mind, that music. What are you doing?" The human shrugged, a gesture that looked strange with his narrow shoulders and lack of proper upper limbs. "Humans think in strange ways," he said. "We can't help it. It's just how our brains work." Velshira did not believe him for a moment, but she set aside her suspicion and dove back into his mind with more force. She had broken species with mental defenses far more sophisticated than simple music, and she would not be stopped by this primitive creature. But as the hours passed and the melody continued to shift and change and block her every advance, she began to realize that this interrogation might not be as simple as she had assumed. The music was everywhere in his mind, a constant wall of sound that kept her from reaching the thoughts beneath. And every time she found a gap in the melody, another song would begin to fill it. She heard what he called lullabies, soft and gentle songs that seemed designed to soothe frightened children. And she heard military marches with strong rhythms and simple words, and she heard something he called jazz, which was a chaotic explosion of sound that made her neural receptors ache with its complexity. By the end of the first session, Velshira was exhausted in a way she had never experienced before. She sat back in her chair and looked at Marcus Chun with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "You are doing this deliberately," she said. The human met her gaze without flinching, and for a moment she saw something flicker in those strange eyes, something that looked almost like concern. "Humans have been lying to each other for 200,000 years. Commander," he said softly, "we've had a long time to learn how to protect our thoughts from those who would take them without permission." Velshira stood abruptly, her robe swirling around her as she moved toward the door. "This changes nothing," she told him. "I will return tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until your defenses break, because they always break in the end." Marcus nodded, and that sad smile returned to his face. "I know," he said, "but I hope you'll be careful, Commander, for both our sakes." She paused at the door, confused by his words. But she did not turn around. "Careful of what?" she asked. "Of what you might find," he answered. "When you finally get past the music." Velshira left the cell without responding. But as she walked back through the cold metal corridors, she could not shake the feeling that something about this interrogation was very wrong. The human had not seemed like a prisoner protecting secrets. He had seemed like a man trying to protect someone else from a danger they did not understand. But that was ridiculous, of course, because what could a soft, fragile, primitive human possibly know that a mindweaver did not? She would return tomorrow and find out. The days turned into weeks, and Velshira found herself spending more and more time in the human cell, pushing against the endless walls of music that protected his mind. Each session left her more exhausted than the last, and she began to notice things she had never noticed before during an interrogation. She noticed how Marcus would watch her with quiet attention when she arrived each morning, and how his strange wet eyes would track her movements as she settled into her chair across from him. She noticed how he would sometimes pause in the middle of their silent mental battle, and she would catch fragments of his surface thoughts before the music rushed back to cover them. Those fragments confused her more than anything else. They were not thoughts of fear or hatred or desperate resistance, which were the emotions she expected from a prisoner fighting against mental invasion. Instead, they were thoughts of concern and worry, and they seemed to be directed at her rather than at himself. One morning, she arrived at his cell looking more tired than usual, because she had spent the night reviewing the data from the Prometheus and trying to understand what the humans had been researching in that remote sector of space. Marcus looked at her with those strange eyes, and she felt a flicker of something warm touch her telepathic senses. Before the music swelled up to hide it, "You haven't been sleeping," he said. And it was not a question. Velshira sat down heavily in her chair, too exhausted to maintain her usual commanding posture. "That is not your concern," she said. "Maybe not," the human replied, and his voice was gentle in a way that made something in her chest feel strange. "But you should take better care of yourself, Commander." She stared at him, trying to understand why a prisoner would say such a thing to his interrogator. "Why do you care about my well-being?" she asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and she saw a shadow pass across his face, a look of sadness so deep that it made her own heart ache in sympathy. "Because someone should," he said finally. Velshira did not know how to respond to that, so she simply pushed into his mind once again and resumed her attack on the walls of music. Today, the songs were different, slower and more melancholic, and she found herself getting lost in their strange beauty, even as she fought to get past them. She heard what he called blues, songs about loss and pain and loneliness that seemed to echo her own exhaustion. And she heard classical pieces with complex structures that reminded her of the mathematical precision of Mindweaver thought, and beneath it all, just barely visible through the gaps in the music, she sensed those same warm feelings of concern and worry that she had noticed before. He was thinking about her again, noticing things about her that she had not even noticed about herself. He had observed that her secondary eyes were dimmer than they had been when they first met, a sign of mental fatigue that most non-Mindweavers would never recognize. He had noticed that she was holding her shoulders differently, hunched forward in a way that suggested she was carrying a weight too heavy for her. He was worried about what the interrogations were doing to her mind, and he was trying to figure out how to protect her from something that she could not yet see. Velshira pulled back from his thoughts so suddenly that she nearly fell out of her chair. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. Marcus looked at her calmly, but she could see the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the edge of the table. "What was what?" he asked, using the same innocent tone he had used in their first meeting. "You were thinking about me, worrying about me. I felt it before your music covered it again." The human was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was tired and heavy with something that sounded like grief. "I told you to be careful, Commander," he said. "I told you there were things you might not want to find." "I want to know everything," Velshira said fiercely. "That is my job. That is what I was born to do. And you will not keep your secrets from me forever." Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. And when he opened them again, she saw something new in his gaze, a kind of desperate determination that made her suddenly afraid. "You really want to know what's in my mind?" he asked. "You want to know what I'm protecting you from?" "Yes," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Then stop fighting the music and let me show you," he said. "Let me lower my defenses, just for a moment, and see what I have been trying to keep hidden from you." Velshira hesitated, because in all her years as an interrogator, no prisoner had ever offered to open their mind to her willingly. It felt like a trap. But she could not imagine what kind of trap it could be, because she was the telepath, and he was the primitive human with no mental powers of his own. "Very well," she said. "Show me." Marcus nodded and closed his eyes, and the music in his mind began to fade. It did not stop all at once, but slowly diminished like a song reaching its final notes, and as the melodies fell away one by one, Velshira saw what lay beneath them. She saw memories of the Prometheus, of laboratories filled with strange equipment and scientists working on projects she did not understand. She saw the moment when they had discovered something in the deep void of space, something old and vast and terrible, a consciousness that had existed since before the first stars. were born, and she saw what that consciousness had done. When the humans got too close to understanding it, it had not destroyed the Prometheus with weapons or force, because it did not need such crude tools. Instead, it had reached out with tendrils of psychic energy and touched the minds of every telepathic species that had ever been part of the Galactic Coalition. It had been feeding on them for millennia, hiding in the networks of mental communication that connected the great telepathic races. And the humans had accidentally stumbled upon evidence of its existence. The Prometheus had been destroyed to keep that secret. And Marcus had only survived because he was human, because his mind was closed and silent and invisible to the thing that lurked in the spaces between thoughts. But that was not the worst of what Velshira saw. The worst was what Marcus had discovered during their very first interrogation session, when she had reached into his mind and he had felt something else reaching back through her. The Mind Weavers were not just victims of this ancient parasite. They were its hosts, its primary food source, and it had woven itself so deeply into their telepathic networks that it was now a part of everything they did. Every time Velshira touched Marcus's mind, she brought that thing with her, and it was hungry for the strange new prey that it could sense but could not reach. The music in his mind had never been a defense against her. It had been a shield to protect her from the monster that lived inside her own consciousness. The parasite that she had never known was there, feeding on her thoughts and the thoughts of every mind weaver in the galaxy. Velshira pulled out of his mind with a scream that echoed through the detention level, and she fell backwards out of her chair and scrambled away from him until her back hit the cold metal wall. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression of infinite sadness. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was rough with exhaustion. "I didn't want you to find out this way, but you wouldn't stop pushing, and I couldn't keep shielding you forever." "Shielding me?" Velshira's voice was barely a whisper. "You were protecting me?" "From the first moment you touched my mind," Marcus confirmed. "I felt it reaching through you, trying to get to me. And I knew that if I let it succeed, it would consume you too." He held up his hands, and she saw that they were trembling, and she noticed for the first time that there was blood dripping from his nose and staining his simple prisoner's clothes. "The music takes everything I have," he said. "It burns my mind a little more each day, but it's the only way I know to create interference, to keep that thing from using our connection to hurt you." Velshira stared at him with all four of her eyes, and for the first time in her long career as an interrogator, she did not know what to say. This fragile human had been destroying himself to protect her, and she had spent weeks trying to break down the very defenses that were keeping her safe. Velshira sat on the floor of the cell for a long time, her back against the cold wall and her four eyes staring at nothing. Everything she had ever known about herself and her people had just been torn apart, and she did not know how to begin putting the pieces back together. Marcus had not moved from his chair, and he watched her with patient concern while the blood from his nose slowly dried on his face. Finally, she found her voice again, though it came out thin and broken. "How long?" she asked. "How long has this thing been feeding on my people?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't know exactly," he said. "The data we recovered on the Prometheus suggested it has been part of the galaxy for millions of years, maybe longer. And it seems to have attached itself to telepathic species whenever they evolved to a point where they could sustain it. Millions of years," Velshira repeated, and the words felt impossible. "That would mean it's been with us since before we developed space travel. Since before we joined the coalition, since before we became what we are." "I'm sorry," Marcus said again, and she could hear the genuine grief in his voice. "I know this isn't what you wanted to find," Velshira laughed, and it was a harsh, broken sound that echoed off the metal walls. "I thought I was the predator," she said. "I thought I was the one with all the power. The great mind-weaver commander who could break any mind in the galaxy. And all along I was just food for something I couldn't even see. She looked up at Marcus with eyes that were wet with tears she did not know how to shed. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "Why did you let me keep attacking you when you knew the truth from the beginning?" The human's face twisted with something that looked like pain. "Would you have believed me?" he asked gently. "If a prisoner, a primitive human with no telepathic abilities, told you that your entire species was infected by a psychic parasite, would you have listened, or would you have assumed I was trying to manipulate you?" Valshira wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she would have taken his words seriously. But she knew in her heart that he was right. She would have dismissed his claims as desperate lies, as a pathetic attempt to avoid interrogation. And she would have pushed even harder into his mind to punish him for the deception. "So you protected me instead," she said. "You took the burden on yourself and tried to shield me from something I refused to see." Marcus nodded, and she noticed that his hands were still shaking and his face had gone pale beneath the dried blood. "I couldn't let it have you," he said quietly. "I've watched that thing consume minds through the data we recovered. I've seen what happens when it finds new prey. And I couldn't just sit here and let it destroy you while you were trying to help your people." "Help my people," Valshira repeated bitterly. "I was trying to torture you for information. That's not helping anyone. You were doing your job," Marcus said with a small shrug. "You were trying to protect your civilization from a potential threat. And you couldn't have known that the real threat was already inside you." "It's not your fault, Commander." Valshira stared at him in wonder. Because this fragile creature had every reason to hate her, and yet he was offering her forgiveness instead. She pushed herself up from the floor on shaking legs and walked slowly back to her chair, sitting down across from him as she had done every day for weeks. But this time, everything was different. Because now she was not the interrogator seeking secrets. She was a frightened woman looking for answers from the only person who might be able to help her. "What do we do now?" she asked. "How do we fight this thing?" Marcus wiped the blood from his face with his sleeve and took a deep breath. "That's what I've been trying to figure out since the Prometheus," he said. "The parasite exists in the psychic connections between telepathic minds. It lives in the space where thoughts travel from one consciousness to another. So the only way to starve it is to close those connections." "You mean stop using our telepathy," Valshira said. And the horror in her voice was unmistakable. "Yes," Marcus confirmed. "Your people would need to learn how to build walls in their minds. How to create barriers that block outside influences. How to think privately instead of openly." "That's impossible," Valshira said. "We've never lived that way. We don't know how. Our entire civilization is built on the ability to share thoughts and feelings with each other. If we close ourselves off, we'll be alone, truly alone." For the first time in our history, Marcus reached across the table and gently took her hand. And the warmth of his touch was startling after so many days of cold mental conflict. "I know it sounds terrifying," he said. "Humans evolved in silence. We've always been alone in our heads. And for us, that's just normal. But I can imagine how frightening it must be for a species that has never known that kind of isolation. How can you be so calm about this?" Valshira asked. "Your ship was destroyed. Your colleagues are dead, and you've been burning yourself alive to protect someone who was trying to break you. How are you not angry? How are you not afraid?" Marcus smiled, and it was the same sad smile she had seen in their first meeting. But now she understood the weight behind it. "I am afraid," he admitted. "I'm terrified, actually, because I don't know if my plan will work. And I don't know how much longer I can keep up the music before my mind gives out completely. But fear doesn't help anyone. It doesn't solve problems or save lives. So I choose to focus on what I can do instead of what I'm afraid of." Valshira squeezed his hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "Humans are strange creatures," she said. "I've studied hundreds of species across the galaxy, and I've never encountered anything quite like you. That's because you usually see species at their worst," Marcus replied. "You see them when they're captured and afraid and fighting for survival. You don't get to see them at their best, building things and caring for each other and dreaming about the future. Tell me about humans at their best," Velshira said. "Tell me how your species learned to live in silence without going mad from loneliness." Marcus leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment before answering. "Humans have always been alone in their heads," he began. "We can't share thoughts directly like your people do. So we had to invent other ways to connect with each other. We created language and art and music. We learned to read expressions on each other's faces and tones in each other's voices. We developed trust not through certainty, but through experience." He paused and looked at her with those strange wet eyes. When a human says they love someone, they can never be completely sure that the other person loves them back. He continued, "We have no way to verify it. No telepathic connection to prove it. We just have to trust. And that trust is the most precious thing we have, because it's given freely, not taken by force." Velshira tried to imagine what that would be like. Forming bonds with other beings without ever truly knowing their thoughts. And the concept was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. "You think my people can learn to live that way?" she asked. "I think your people can learn anything," Marcus said firmly. "You've already proven that you're adaptable and resilient. You've built an incredible civilization across thousands of worlds. And you've survived challenges that would have destroyed lesser species. This is just one more challenge, and you'll face it the same way you faced everything else." Together, Velshira felt something stir in her chest. A small spark of hope that she had not expected to feel. "Will you help us?" she asked. "Will you teach us how to be alone in our heads without losing ourselves?" Marcus smiled, and this time there was real warmth in it. "I thought you'd never ask." The first step was convincing the Mindweaver High Council that the threat was real. And this proved to be far more difficult than Velshira had expected. She stood before the 12 most powerful telepaths in her civilization. Beings who had ruled for centuries and who had never once questioned the nature of their mental gifts. And she tried to explain that everything they believed about themselves was a lie. They did not want to listen. "This is absurd," said Elder Kethful, his ancient eyes narrowing with disapproval. "You expect us to believe that a primitive human discovered something about our own minds that we have never noticed in 10,000 years of history." "He didn't discover it through telepathy," Velshira explained, trying to keep her voice calm. "He discovered it through research and observation, through the kind of patient scientific work that humans excel at. And he found evidence that we could never have found because we were too close to see it. Too close." Elder Miravan laughed, and it was a cold, dismissive sound. "We are the Mindweavers. Commander, we see everything. We know everything. And we will not be lectured about our own nature by a species that can barely communicate without flapping their mouths and making noise." Velshira felt her frustration rising. But before she could respond, Marcus stepped forward from where he'd been standing quietly behind her, with respect. "Elder," he said, and his voice was calm and unafraid. "You see everything that exists within the realm of thought, but this creature exists between thoughts. In the connections rather than the minds themselves. It is like a fish trying to see water. You cannot perceive something that is the very medium through which you perceive." The council members shifted uncomfortably, and Velshira could sense their skepticism beginning to waver. Elder Kethval leaned forward and fixed Marcus with a piercing stare. "You claim to have proof of this parasite," he said. "Show it to us." Marcus nodded and looked at Velshira. "Commander, with your permission, I would like to demonstrate what happens when a Mindweaver attempts to read my thoughts." Velshira hesitated, because she knew how much the music cost him. But Marcus gave her a small, Reassuring nod. It's the only way to make them understand, he said quietly. She stepped back and watched as Elder Kethvil rose from his seat and approached Marcus with predatory confidence. Very well, human, the Elder said. Let us see what secrets you think you are hiding. He reached out with his telepathic senses, and Valshira saw his expression change from arrogance to confusion as he encountered the wall of music in Marcus's mind. But that was not the demonstration Marcus had intended. Do you feel it? Marcus asked, and his voice was strained with effort as he fought to maintain his defenses. Do you feel something else reaching through you? Something hungry that you've never noticed before? Elder Kethvil's face went pale, and he staggered backward as if he had been struck. There is something there, he whispered, and his voice was filled with horror. I felt it move when I touched his mind. I felt it reaching for him through me. What is that thing? The other council members began speaking all at once, their mental voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and denial. And Valshara raised her hand to silence them. That is what has been feeding on our people for millennia, she said firmly. The human has been shielding us from it during every interrogation session, burning his own mind to create interference so that it cannot use our connection to reach him. She pointed at Marcus, who was swaying slightly from the effort of maintaining his mental defenses. This primitive creature, as you called him, has been protecting us from something we didn't even know existed. And now he's offering to teach us how to protect ourselves. The council was silent for a long moment. And then Elder Miravan spoke in a voice that had lost all its earlier contempt. What must we do? She asked, and so began what the Mindweavers would later call the Great Preparation. Marcus worked with their scientists and their teachers and their philosophers, explaining the techniques that humans use to maintain mental privacy, demonstrating the walls and barriers that separated one consciousness from another. It was not easy, because the Mindweavers had never needed such skills, and learning to close off their minds felt as unnatural to them as learning to stop breathing. It hurts, young Telvara said during one of the training sessions, tears streaming from all four of her eyes. It feels like I'm dying inside, like I'm cutting off pieces of my own soul. Marcus knelt beside her and took her trembling hands in his own. I know it hurts, he said gently. Humans have a word for this feeling. We call it loneliness. And it's one of the hardest things our species has ever had to endure. But I promise you that it gets easier. And I promise you that the connections you make after learning to be alone will be stronger and more meaningful than anything you've ever known. Telvara looked up at him with wet, confused eyes. How can connections be stronger if we can't share minds anymore? She asked. Because they will be chosen, Marcus explained. Right now, your mental bonds are automatic. You share thoughts because you can't help it. But after you learn to close your minds, every moment of sharing will be a gift, freely given and freely received. And gifts are always more precious than obligations. Valshira watched these sessions from the corner of the room, and she found herself falling in love with the patience and kindness that Marcus showed to her people. He never lost his temper when they struggled. He never judged them when they failed. And he never stopped believing that they could learn to survive without the telepathic connections that had defined their species for thousands of years. One evening, after a particularly difficult training session, she found him sitting alone on a balcony overlooking the city, and she could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. You're pushing yourself too hard, she said. Sitting down beside him, the nosebleeds are getting worse. And I can see how much the music is costing you, Marcus shrugged. But he did not deny it. There's so much to do, he said. And I don't know how much time we have before the parasite realizes what we're planning and tries to stop us. You're just one human, Valshira said. You can't save an entire civilization by yourself. He looked at her with those strange, wet eyes, and she saw something in them that made her heart's ache. Maybe not, he admitted. But I can try, and trying is all any of us can do. She reached out and took his hand. And this time the gesture felt natural and right. You're not alone anymore, she told him. Whatever happens, you have me, and my people will fight beside you. Marcus smiled. And for the first time since she had met him, it was not a sad smile. It was hopeful. The Mindweavers called it the Quieting, and it was the most difficult century in their entire history across 1,000 worlds. Billions of telepaths learned to close their minds for the first time, to build walls where there had always been open doors, to exist in silence where there had always been a chorus of shared thoughts. Many thought they were dying. And in a way they were, because the beings they had been for 10,000 years were fading away, replaced by something new and strange and frightening. Parents could no longer feel the emotions of their children. Lovers could no longer share their deepest feelings without words. And communities that had once been bound by mental harmony found themselves struggling to communicate through the crude tools of language and gesture. There were riots in some places, as citizens rebelled against the loss of everything they had known. And there were suicides among those who could not bear the silence. And there were moments when Velshira wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. But through it all, Marcus was there, traveling from world to world, teaching and comforting and inspiring, showing her people that silence did not have to mean loneliness. It's just a different kind of connection. He told them again and again. It's harder to build, but it's yours in a way that the old bonds never were. Because you choose it, because you work for it, because you earn it every single day. And slowly, painfully, the Mindweavers began to understand what he meant. They learned to read expressions on each other's faces, to hear emotions in the tone of each other's voices, to trust without the certainty that telepathy had always provided. They developed new art forms that expressed feelings through color and sound and movement. And they created new rituals for bonding that did not require the sharing of minds. And as they learned, the ancient parasite began to starve. Velshira felt it dying in the back of her consciousness, a presence she had never noticed until Marcus had shown her it was there. Fading as its food source dried up, its death screams echoed through what remained of the telepathic networks. And those screams were terrible to hear, filled with rage and hunger and a desperate need that would never again be satisfied. But they did not weaken. They did not give in, and they did not open their minds no matter how loudly the creature howled. On the day when the last echoes of the parasite's consciousness finally faded into nothing, Velshira stood before the High Council and wept with relief. "It's gone," she said, and her voice broke with emotion. After millions of years, after consuming countless telepathic species across the galaxy, the thing that lived inside us is finally dead. The council members did not cheer or celebrate, because they had lost too much to feel simple joy. But there was a quiet pride in their eyes as they looked at each other. They had survived the unsurvivable. They had changed in ways they had never thought possible. And they had done it together 20 years after the end of the quieting. Velshira found Marcus in the memorial garden on the anniversary of the parasite's death. He was older now, his hair completely gray, his face lined with the marks of age that humans wore so openly. But those strange, wet eyes still sparkled with curiosity and warmth. She sat down beside him on the bench overlooking the garden, and they watched the sunset together in comfortable silence. "My people wish to honor you," she said finally. "They want to build statues and name holidays after you. The human who taught an entire species to think for themselves." Marcus shook his head, and she saw a familiar gentle smile cross his face. "I didn't teach you anything you didn't already have inside you," he said. "I just showed you what humans learned the hard way over 200,000 years of evolution. Every child figures it out eventually, that being alone in your head isn't a curse." He turned to look at her. and she felt her heart swell with the love she had come to feel for this fragile, wonderful creature. It's what makes connection mean something, he continued. If you can't keep anyone out, then letting someone in has no value. But if you choose to open your walls, if you decide to trust someone with your innermost thoughts, that choice is the most precious gift you can give. Velshira reached out and took his hand, a gesture that had become as natural to her as breathing, and she marveled at how much meaning she found in the simple warmth of his skin against hers. I never thought I would be grateful for silence, she admitted. So long I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to us. But now I understand why your species treasures it so deeply. Tell me why, Marcus said. And she could hear the curiosity in his voice, the desire to understand that had driven him through everything they had endured together. Velshira thought for a moment before answering. Because silence is the space where trust is built, she said slowly. It's the darkness that makes the light meaningful. The distance that makes closeness precious, when you can't read someone's mind, when you can't be certain of their feelings. You have to believe in them without proof, and that belief, that faith, that trust, it changes everything. Marcus squeezed her hand, and she saw tears forming in his strange wet eyes. That's beautiful, he said. That's exactly what I was hoping your people would discover. They sat together as the sun dropped below the horizon and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. And Velshira felt a peace that she had never known in all her long years as a mind-weaver. She could no longer read Marcus's thoughts, could no longer sense his emotions through telepathic connection, but she did not need to, because she knew him in a deeper way than she had ever known anyone before. She had earned his trust through years of working beside him, through shared struggles and shared victories and shared moments of quiet understanding. And that trust was more valuable to her than any telepathic bond could ever be. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Giving up your career, your life among humans to help a species that tried to break you? Marcus turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes was so clear that she did not need telepathy to see it. I found something more important than my career, he said simply. I found a purpose, and I found you. And I wouldn't trade that for anything in the galaxy. Velshira leaned over and kissed him, a gesture she had learned from his species. And she felt the warmth of connection that had nothing to do with mental powers when she pulled back. She saw that he was smiling, and she was smiling too. And the silence between them was filled with meaning that words could never capture. What happens now? She asked. The quieting is over. The parasite is dead. What do we do with the rest of our lives? Marcus looked out at the stars, at the vast universe that held so many wonders and so many dangers. And his smile grew wider. We live, he said. We explore and we learn and we build new things. We make connections with each other and with other species. And we face whatever challenges come next together. He turned back to her, and his eyes held the same fierce hope that she had seen on the day when he first offered to teach her people. That's what humans do, he said. That's what we've always done, and now your people do it too. You're not just mind weavers anymore. You're something new, something stronger. Something that chose to change instead of being destroyed. Velshira nodded, feeling the truth of his words in her heart. We learned from the best, she said, and as the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, two beings from vastly different species sat together in the darkness, holding hands and trusting each other, and finding in their chosen connection something more precious than any telepathic bond could ever be. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of love, freely given and freely received. The greatest gift that any being could offer to another, and that was enough. That was everything.